a wide variety of different projects that I'm sure you're all thinking about. Just to say at the beginning, one of the reasons for asking questions at the end is so that people who are watching the recording can just see the sort of the whole information section in one go. But please do note them down, or as Paula said, pop them into the chat, and we'll try and pick them up at the end as well. Just to sort of say, for those of you who were working with UKSPF last year in Rochford, you will find some slight changes to the application form. And certainly to the budget format. And this time, what you will be provided with is a draft in Word format, as you've had previously, but you will be asked then to actually apply online. You'll see the link, you'll be provided with that, but you will need to cut and paste from your Word document, whereas your Excel and budget documents will just be uploaded straight away. In terms of the presentation today, what we're trying to do is to look not just at UKSPF funding, although that will be an important part of it, but what we're trying to do is to impart some of our experience and knowledge on how we feel you could most effectively look at your grant applications, not just for UKSPF, although we will focus on that today, but sort of more general thinking as well. Okay, thank you, Laurie. If we could go to the next slide. Thanks. Okay, this sounds extremely basic, but it's the first thing that we would do if we were looking at putting in a bid application, really understanding what the funder is asking you. You usually find that there's usually an application form, so that's good to have a look at that, understand the types of questions. Often there's additional information provided. In the case of UKSPF, you'll see there's a really quite extensive guidance document that also goes through how you can help fill in some of those, some of the questions. And in some types of funding, you may be able to look at how they're going to be scored or how they're selected as well. So you begin to kind of build up a little bit of a picture of the sort of weighting that might come into some of the questions. Check that you are eligible. Different grant schemes have different requirements. Some you might need to be a constituted organisation, a charity or a business. Perhaps that might be self-employed or freelancer. But just check what is the requirement. Some people will only work with charities. For UKSPF, all of these are applicable, but obviously no individuals applying. You might find that there are criteria around needing to be a local organisation or deliver within a geographic area. Certainly for UKSPF, you have to be delivering in the Rochford area, but your organisation doesn't have to be based in Rochford. And generally, if you're working with people, the expectation would be that you were working with local people. So if the project doesn't quite fit the funder's aims, and you need to think about that, can you adapt it? So, you know, that might mean they have particular targets or outputs or other requirements that you hadn't really thought about. And this is a really critical question, because if you don't feel that your project quite fits or you can't slightly adapt it, you have to ask whether it's the right thing to be spending your time on as well. Okay, Laurie, next slide. So an example for UKSPF. Think about what it is that you are being asked to deliver. So this is the sort of overarching funders' requirements. You've got the intervention E1, which is improvements to town centres, high streets, better accessibility, and you can include capital spend and running costs. When you look at heritage and culture, existing cultural, historic and heritage institutions that make up the local cultural heritage offer. So you have to kind of unpick that a bit and think about what those words mean. Here you can see that government have provided a little bit of an example of what they're thinking about when they do this. But if your project doesn't quite fit this, can you adapt it? If it doesn't fit it at all, should you be applying for the funding? So this is kind of my sort of first step that I would go through if I was thinking about a new project and a funding stream. All of this information is in the guidance, so don't worry as we flick through. One of the things I would always suggest is that when you're thinking about your project, start with a very rough outline, write it down, put down your main ideas, but then I would actually leave it and I would actually start looking at some of the other key questions, especially thinking about my budget, any targets or outputs that I have to hit or I want to hit, and then the timings. And then I would probably come back to do the full draft. And this is the way that we've presented the project, the sort of plan as we go through, which is thinking about what are the most important things to work on rather than going through a list of the questions. So you'll see we jump about a little bit, but it's where you need to focus. So I'm going to assume that you've done all the rest of the work and you're coming back to think about your project. I would think about a couple of sentences at the beginning that clearly set it out what your project is and what it's going to deliver. I think that gives people reading this a really good idea before they start getting down into the detail. It's fixed in their minds what it is you're going to do. Provide some information about your organisation, maybe key staff that are going to be involved in delivery, and perhaps highlight some of the experience. I would tend to try and keep this relatively brief. I have to say, when we've done a lot of project reviews, people are often very comfortable talking about who they are, what they've done, but actually what you're really wanting to do is to just give people a brief idea of who you are and then really talk about the project that you're wanting to deliver. So just be careful of that. Also very important to sort of identify quite early on who you're actually going to be supporting with your project. Are they people that you have contacts with, or is it a project that you already have sort of established links? Have you got the expertise? If you're looking at working with volunteers or participants, how are you going to engage them? What connections have you got in the local area? And here you might want to think about the numbers and any outputs that are linked to those as well. Next slide. My next step in the project description would be think about what you're going to be doing. I find it incredibly helpful to have the timeline in front of me, or a timeline. This can be scribbled on paper. This doesn't have to be terribly sophisticated, but I find it's really useful to just think about what's going to happen when, and also how that links to your budget. So if you put down that you're going to put in some kind of new equipment and that's going to happen in February, but actually it appears in your budget in December, you're kind of disconnected. So it looks odd and it makes people feel that you haven't quite thought through your idea. Another question that really helps as you're thinking about your project is, why is this work necessary? Some questions have, some applications forms have a separate question around need, as UKSPF does. But if not, I would add that into the description. And really importantly, and sort of back to this idea about what the funder wants, one of the commonest mistakes that we see in applications is that people think about their own project. So you're passionate, you really want to do this locally, but actually you're not just thinking about your own project. You need to think about the project the funder is actually wanting you to do. And so here, this is where this idea about outputs, outcomes, and targets becomes really quite important, because you might think that an output is helping 50 people. The funder might say that actually you have a different kind of output or metric that you need to meet, and you need to work that in if you can. One other thing that comes through in some funding programs, it's something that's important for UKSPF, is there is a lot of confusion around partnership working. And I just wanted to pick that up here. It's something that if you are deciding on a formal partnership, so that's where you are both going to be drawing funding from the grant programme, you need to think about this as a contract between you. So you would need to have a contract in place to show how you are going to actually deliver different aspects of the work. You would need to put that into your project description. If you're working in informal partnerships, so that you're working through different networks and different communities, that's fine. That's just part of your sort of connections that you have in the local community. At the bottom of the form, you'll see the question that will appear on the UKSPF application form. And the where it will be delivered is important because it is a requirement of the funding. It does need to be within Rochford. And you'll need to also think, in this particular case, how it fits with those interventions that we looked at before. You can look at one intervention, or you could look at two. Two starts to get a little bit more complicated when you're thinking about your project plan and description, but think about how it fits. You'll also see on all the application forms on the Word document a maximum character count. And that's to make sure that when you upload this to the online form, there are maximum set on the online form. So this stops you going over that. Okay, and again, Laurie, thank you. I'll now hand over to Selene, who's just going to look at the financial side of the application as well.
Thank you. Obviously, when you're applying to funding, the really important thing is to make sure that your budget is set and your budget items are eligible. So the first thing I would do is list every single expenditures you will have to cover with the grant. You will need to provide enough details so that you can categorize these expenditures. For instance, sometime in budgets, we've seen someone saying delivery of the workshops. This doesn't give enough details to see what your expenditure is and how much is going to be spent on what. So what you would need to do is say, for instance, I need a member of staff, if this person is employed by your organization, to deliver 15 hours of workshop at a cost of this much. If it's not a member of staff and you're going to request a supplier of service, it could be an artist, it could be someone who's specialized in training, then you will say that this is a supplier of service. The reason why it's so important, especially on staff and supplier of services, is because there are implications around procurement, which I will talk about a little bit later. But that's what I call categorizing your expenditure. So it's to make sure that you say whether it's a supplier of service, supplier of goods, or a staff, and that you do that by describing your expenditures a little bit more. Once you've done your list of expenditures, you will then check your expenditure against the guidance. For instance, with UKSPF, some costs are not eligible. Many of you would have included, for instance, contingency. This is not a cost that is categorized because it's not something eligible. Dividends, for instance, if you're a business and you draw dividends from the business for your time, this is not an eligible cost. Gifts are not eligible under UKSPF. Hospitality and catering. When we say hospitality and catering, it doesn't include refreshments for volunteers. So refreshments for volunteers are eligible, that's fine, not a problem. And if you're applying for, I don't know, you're in the community, you want to deliver a cooking workshop, this doesn't come under hospitality and catering. It will come under supply of the items to be doing the cooking. So that would be eligible as well. So doing your list of expenditures and making sure that you describe as much as you can your expenditures are really important, not just for yourself to check that it's eligible, but also for when you apply, the grant panel will have a look and the assessors will have a look and see whether these costs are eligible and you can get the funding for it. So I've already said, if you have a staff member, for instance, you would describe the number of hours, at what rate. If you are purchasing items, I'm going to say, for instance, 2 laptops, write down that is 2 laptops at what cost, not just the total cost. And this demonstrates that you've really thought through your budget. One important part of this application, especially of your applications, can be whether your costs are capital or revenue. It's important under these UKSPF applications because obviously there are different amounts available and you need to be able to put your costs under the right funding pot. In terms of the capital expenditures, these are usually one-off costs over £5,000. It can be acquiring something, improving or maintaining fixed assets, and it will benefit the organization over a long period of time. These expenditures have to be over £5,000 to be classed as capital. If they are under, it will be considered as revenue. Knowing whether your costs are what costs they are and how much they cost in total will be very important for procurement, which is the next slide. Oh, sorry, it's not the next slide, but that's okay. We can go through the budget and I go through procurement after. So this is the document you will have to fill in for UKSPF in the Rochford district. Here you can see that you've got several columns. The first one on the left is your expenditures, and you can see it's divided between revenue and capital. So this is where you will insert your expenditures with as much detail as you can. And if you need more lines on the revenue, of course, you can add lines. The next column is the cost column. So that will be your total costs for these specific items. And on the right-hand side, you can see that there is a procurement evidence column. So here is just a very simple, a few words to say what will be your process. So we will go through the different the different procurement processes after. But what's very important is that if you've included staff and they are on your payroll, of course you can put NA. The procurement is not eligible; it's not applicable. If your costs are under £2,500, you can put, for instance, one quote or direct award. If you start going over costs which are more than £2,500 to contract out, so it could be a supply of service, it could be you're going to rent a venue over the course of the project and it's going to cost you £3,000, then on there, that's when you start writing free quotations. Or if it's over £25,000, you will write a full tender process. So it's got to be very, on your Excel document, it will be a very simple, just for a few words to describe it, but it's very important that you're sure you've understood the processes you will have to put in place so that your expenditures are eligible. On the next slide, we're going to go through a little bit more of the procurement. So you can see here the rules that apply. So this is about public funding, and usually these rules will always be applicable if you're looking at public funding, like the way we are for UKSPF. So I'm going to just say again, so for purchases up to 2,499, you can make a direct award. So you only need to have one quote, one person that said this will cost you this much, and you can contract out, and they can invoice you directly. For purchases between 2,500 and 24,999, you must get request quotes from at least 3 different suppliers. The way you will choose your preferred supplier is important as well, because you would have to give your criteria. Say, okay, I want the cheapest, for instance, person, or I would like an organization to have, a relatively good value for money in terms of the price, but I also want them to have experience in the area. So you set your criteria and then you choose your preferred supplier. And then once you start having purchases of services or goods over 25,000, this is when you really need to undertake a tender. And we would suggest that you look at the guidance here on the UKSPF guidance, because you will have to follow a specific process and publish your tender on Contracts Finder. These are mandatory steps, so you will need to keep your evidence. For you to understand a little bit more about the process in terms of expenditures, I've got an example. So for instance, if across your project, your project is for a year, in May 2024, you need a graphic designer, you're going to spend £1,000 with them, and you will need a graphic designer again, and you will spend £2,000 in August. You can't do 2 direct awards. You have to add these expenditures together. So that means that £1,000 plus £2,000 will be £3,000 worth of graphic designer costs. And you're planning on using the same graphic designer for the project. Therefore, you should request the quotations from 3 different businesses at the start of your project. You can't split the contract to make it work for yourself, because you'll be spending £3,000 over the course of the project. And that's true for everything. I just gave you an example of a graphic designer because it's easy to split, but it will be true if you do training, it'll be true if you ask someone to do workshops, or, a venue you're going to use for the whole part of your project. It's not about the cost of hiring the venue for once. It's over the course of your project. Are you going to spend more than £2,500? And as I said before, you will need to keep evidence of the process undertaken, so that just in case the funder requests to see the evidence. When I explain this, it may seem difficult, but actually it's not very difficult. As long as you've understood the process, it's actually most of your project will be in the brackets of under £25,000 costs. Unless you're doing a big capital spend, and in that case you would have to go through the Contracts Finder process. But also the council can provide some advice as well and work with you. When you send us your draft application to have a look at, we will review this question and we will provide feedback and help you in terms of identifying, you know, if you've missed one expenditure that should be under the 3 quotes, we will tell you. This is also on the Excel spreadsheet. This is your timeline. So as you're doing your budget, I would suggest you do your timeline as well, because it really helps you to identify the steps in your project. This is where you will explain what you're going to deliver when. And for instance, you will ask, okay, if I need a new member of staff, when am I going to start the recruitment process? You know, sometimes it can take a month or two. What are my key spend activities, such as events, the recruitment of volunteers, when I'm going to report for the expenditures as well, and when am I going to achieve my outputs and targets? So it's really to help you out in understanding when you're going to spend what and when you're going to deliver what. So in this, you will, for instance, put, as you can see in the example, you put recruitment of the workshop facilitator, and you will tick the box or color the box to say when that's going to happen. If you've got specific dates and you already know when your events are going to be implemented, then you could put, okay, 15th of June, you will go in the June month and you put 15th. It's very rare we get timelines that are this detailed, but it's always very good to see because it shows how ready you are to spend the funding. This is not something that you get in every application. You will get it in the UKSPF funding. It's not in every grant program you can apply to, but it is a useful and simple tool to use for your project management and to develop your budget. So it could be something you decide to do for every application you apply for. Okay, you're on mute.
Yes, I've just realized, sorry. Okay, so again, something that doesn't appear in every application form, but certainly we will see this in the UKSPF one, is what is the need? Now, this is a really important question when people are reviewing applications. It's showing that this is not just something that you are passionate about and want to do, but it's something that is actually needed by the community in which you're working. It could also be that the funder is looking to show that you meet the needs of other sort of wider strategic programs as well. Laurie, do you mind just clicking on the next 2 clicks for me? Thanks. Okay, so this brings up the 2 questions that you'll find in the UKSPF application form. So one is about the needs of meeting sort of health and well-being as part of your application, whatever that is within the district. And the other one is, how do you know the community need or want this project? For very large organisations, it may well be that they've actually commissioned research. They might have survey data. It's quite unusual. For most applicants, it's going to be about perhaps small surveys, and that might be people that they are working with already. It could be asking them those questions. It could be providing quotes from local people who've been engaged in similar things or see it as a gap and a problem, that's something that's missing. It's actually trying to build that sort of evidence. It could be examples of similar projects that you've worked on perhaps outside the area and the kind of impact they've had. Have you tested your idea with the community or maybe even run a pilot? So think about how you can demonstrate that there is a need for this and that you can meet the needs of the local authorities' requirements as well. Next slide, please. Many funders have some kind of target or outcome that they're trying to achieve with their funding. The Arts Council might be wanting to see audience members or participants. There are different things that different funders, different charitable trusts are looking for. It may well be that an outcome can be a number, or it could even be in some cases as simple as a case study. And we have seen examples of that in small charitable trust work. But what we have to accept is that for government funded grants, there is an increasing requirement for what is called outputs and outcomes. We've seen this through several programs now, and it's very much linked to their evaluation program that they do around their funding. And they're trying to work out what's working well and what is good value for money. So for UKSPF, there are outputs and outcomes, and these are one of the areas that people find most difficult to deal with when they're making their applications. And I know we've talked to a lot of people in the last few months about these. Next slide, please, Laurie. Okay, for people who have worked before on the programme, you will have seen this slide. Next 2 clicks, please, Laurie. Thank you. The top section are the outputs and the bottom ones are the outcomes. And as Paula said, to meet the requirements for the UKSPF funding, you need to actually meet one outcome and one output from whichever intervention you select. Now, if you select 2 interventions, you will need to do that for each of the interventions. That's a minimum. Some people feel that their projects can meet more than that. And some have actually looked at nearly all of them. So a minimum of one output and one outcome. Now, that can be quite challenging when you're thinking about your project. And this is probably the area that is most difficult to align for some people with their project idea. It is very much part of the panel and the scoring review. And this would obviously be something that would have to be met. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. When you look at your application form, this is what you will see. Here for intervention E1, you can see that there are 2 outputs and 4 outcomes that you can select from. And you will need to provide a number against any one of these, one output, one outcome or more. And importantly, you need to give us a little bit of an idea as to how you're going to collect the data and evidence it. Now, for a series, perhaps, let me just have a look at a decarbonisation plan developed. You might just say copies of decarbonisation plan. Simple as that. Jobs created. Again, this might be something that you have some kind of written evidence for, but you will need to be able to evidence it as part of your reporting. Next slide, please. If we look at intervention E4, there are 3 outputs and 3 outcomes that you can select from. And again, exactly the same as before, you need to put in numbers and you need to provide the evidence. Now, one thing that you really need to think about for UKSPF and these outputs and outcomes is that government has very specific definitions of what these actually mean. And I absolutely suggest that you look into the guidance that's being provided by Rochford, and you will find a link to the definitions of the outputs and outcomes. And I really strongly recommend that you look at these because some of these may not be quite, you might not interpret them in quite the same way as government does. So you do need to look at that. Okay, but again, something really to get your head around quite early on. Don't leave this to the end and then see if you can add them in. You need to weave this into your project description. It needs to make it work all the way through. Okay, just conscious of time, just picking up on a few of the sort of other questions that you will see. So again, on the application form, you're going to be asked to talk about your quality and diversity in your work and funding. Here, just really taking a sort of 3-point plan approach that I think is quite helpful. I would always think about this in 3 ways: about your organisation, how you've shaped the project to support equality and diversity, and is it something that you'll be communicating to participants? Now, not all projects fit within that sort of method. You might be doing a major capital work, but it's thinking about it. It's setting the scene for your own ethos, and then how you've thought about it within the project. Next slide, please. Sustainability, net zero and climate change is another one of the questions you'll see on the UKSPF form and increasingly on other application forms as well. These are very much cross-cutting themes that government and many other organisations are now wanting to support. Again, I think a three-step approach can be useful. So organisation. What are you doing? You might be cutting emissions from your building. You might be thinking about your staff and staff travel. There are other areas that people are working on, perhaps more in the sustainability area, such as recycling, upcycling, reusing, and so on. And the idea again is to just build that ethos behind you as an organisation. How have you shaped the project? We've seen some fantastic examples in the creative sector where people have really thought about the types of materials they're using, upcycling. They're sort of building their sustainability ideas into the programme, based in a park, looking at cycling, looking at active travel to come to them, very centrally based. Again, is it something you're going to communicate to participants? Again, something not only from creative projects, but we've seen climate change coming through as part of the design and creativity work that participants have been involved in. But we've also seen some very exciting work through some organisations who are providing volunteer and caring support, where they've actually been linking through to things like fuel poverty and energy bill reduction support. So, really trying to build this into some of the delivery as well. Next slide, please. Reporting. In some shape or form, most funders want some sort of report. And again, this is something that I just try and flick through and think in my mind at the beginning, what is it they're going to want? Some people want something at the end of the programme. Arts Council, again, look at an end of project activity report. And they want to see how the money has been spent and what you've achieved with it. In some shape or form, you just need to make sure you've built that into your project. I would suggest for UKSPF and other projects, you need to think about the role. Who's going to actually be responsible for this? You might have a team helping, but who's actually going to be the one who's responsible? And that you don't have to name, it can be a role. They're going to manage the reporting, so they're going to be thinking about making sure the evidence is filed, it's collected, it's filed, the finances are being kept up to date, the procurement information is stuck in a folder, all this kind of stuff that can then be drawn out and provided for the reporting. For UKSPF, the reporting is quarterly. It is not particularly onerous. Government have got a fairly light touch, but you will need to have the information available. Okay, next one, please. Okay, just really to pick up on something that is not seen in all applications. It's something that's quite useful for you to think about, and many of you actually do anyway, but is risk assessment, risk and mitigation. It is in the UKSPF form. It's becoming increasingly so in public grants. I find it really helpful to think about the risks in the wider project sense, as well as directly. So this might be the risks for the UKSPF. Will you meet the outputs and outcomes? What happens if you don't get the procurement right? Could there be a problem of clawback, that kind of thing? And or it could be that you need to have DBS checks in place because you're working with very young people. Just think about what are the key risks. As someone who's assessed grant applications, I have to say some of the easiest to read are where someone puts risk, what it is, mitigation, what they're going to do about it. It's very easy to read, it's quick to see, and it shows that you've thought those through. Most people are looking for 3 or 4 major risks. They're not looking for an enormous risk assessment document. So it's just picking those out. Next slide, please. Okay, and just sort of picking up on something that's important in all of this grant funding, especially public funding, is legacy, also sometimes described as project sustainability. There are some projects that are very much task and finish, and there may not be a direct ongoing legacy, but in that case, what is the impact of that project? So the legacy still continues to have an effect within the community. For other projects, it might be something that you're looking at continuing on. Perhaps it's a volunteering or community project. How are you going to continue that afterwards, after you've got all this excitement, enthusiasm, you've got the volunteers in place? What's your idea for how that's going to continue? Do you have to look for more funding? Or are the volunteers themselves the ones who are going to continue on and provide the legacy? So again, just to help you as you're thinking that through, we've suggested 3 kind of areas: sustainability of project, how what is the legacy for the beneficiaries, and the kind of general impact legacy. So again, it might be points that you can kind of think around that help you structure the answer to that question as well. I should say, and I should have said at the beginning, but I will say at the end here, the idea behind the application process this year is that you would send in draft applications. So this is written in Word documents and on the Excel budget and timeline sheet. And you would then be able to book calls with Selene and myself for about an hour's worth of guidance after we've had a chance to have a look at your draft forms. So that is something that we'll also be able to offer through this grant programme as well. Thank you very much, Laurie. Okay, and just getting sort of onto that final application stage. So you've done all this work, you've got it pulled together, we've had a discussion, you've gone back if you felt you needed to make any changes. I just wanted to pick up on a piece at the end which has caused a little bit of confusion. When you actually go to do your online application and put all of the documents on, you can add quite a lot of documents to that. You'll need to add on your budget milestone spreadsheet that needs to be uploaded. If you have any evidence in terms of quotes or links, they need to be added on. And you'll need to upload your public liability insurance certificate. And then if you're working with vulnerable people, your safeguarding policy. If you are not a registered charity or a registered business, you will have to put in your organisation's constitution or terms of reference would need to be uploaded as well. So this is the sort of final stage of the UKSPF application. If there's anything else you want to add, you can do that too. And I just wanted to pick that up because some people had not quite spotted some of those things when they'd been looking at the draft form. Okay, I think that's us done. So hopefully that's been helpful. I know we'll stop recording in a minute and then very happy to take questions